Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Political Pulse podcast. My name is Ryan Painter, and I am so excited to have Caroline Elliott with me here today. She is a North Vancouver resident, PhD in political science. Do I have that right?
Yeah, pretty much.
And political commentator. You can find her publications in the National Post, the Western Standard, the Hub. If I've missed anything, I'm sure Carol will let me know. She's also a guest. She was recently a guest panelist on Global, talking about all things politics with, I believe, Maria Dobrinskaya, I think you were with. And she's here to talk with us about all kinds of things that have been happening recently. And there is a lot to talk about. I was going to dive in first to Bill 7, but actually, I want to get your reaction, and I'm going to play a video here for viewers and listeners because Mark Carney has been prime minister for like a couple days, 2 or 3 days now, going on a week this Friday, I think. And he's not had a good start up gate. And yesterday, I think, in my opinion, and I'd love to know your thoughts after the clip, I think he's put his foot in it. And we've gotten to really see the kind of person he is. So I'm just going to share this clip from Brian Lilly on X, and we can talk about it on the other end. But just to give folks a bit of an intro, he's at a press conference in London responding to two reporters about his assets. So let's listen to the clip.
Mr. Carney, Stephanie Levitt, Globe and Mail. We understand that you have now placed your assets in a blind trust, so you don't know what's happening to them going forward, but you knew what they were going into that blind trust. So what are they?
Look, Stephanie, I follow the rules of the ethics commissioner. I'm following them well in advance of any of the requirements, as you know, because I know you know this. You know that these requirements come into effect in months. We're talking days after I became prime minister. So I'm complying with the rules of the ethics commissioner, going through the processes and all these things that are necessary. And I will remind you, and I'll remind Canadians again, that the leader of the opposition cannot find it. And look, you look at the questions this evening, you look at the nature of the discussions, look at the nature of discussions I had with the president of France, the prime minister of the United Kingdom. The leader of the opposition would not be capable of having those discussions because the leader of opposition refuses to get his security clearance, something that it took me a few weeks to get. And he has been the leader of the opposition for 3 years. So I comply with my responsibilities. I comply with the rules well in advance. And the leader of the opposition doesn't take his responsibilities at a time of, well, you should take these responsibilities at any time, but it's particularly remarkable given the stakes in global geopolitics at the moment.
The rules say that those assets should be publicly disclosed within 120 days, which means you'll campaign in a coming federal election, most likely within the next 120 days, and are serving as prime minister now, with Canadians not being aware of what potential conflicts of interest.
What's that also a conflict would you have, Stephanie? Stephanie, I'm complying with the rules. I'm complying with the rules in advance. Harvey.
You say you are no any conflict of interest.
Yes.
That most of the time, like the private sector, there's no possible conflict of interest in your assets. It's very difficult to believe.
Look inside yourself, Rosemary.
Wow. So I don't even really know where to start with that. What are your thoughts, Caroline? Because that is just, I don't know if I've seen a prime minister step into it that quickly after becoming prime minister. What are your thoughts?
Well, like I mean, I was actually asked about the prospect of Prime Minister Mark Carney on the Global TV panel that you referenced when you introduced me, and my thoughts were then, and they remain the same now, are that the hypothetical version of Mark Carney that has been boosting the Liberals in the polls until now is very different than the prospect of real Mark Carney as an actual person under actual scrutiny in an election campaign. And I think he's very used to the sort of genteel questioning amongst, fellow bankers and things worldwide where people, interact in a certain way with certain norms of questioning and things that would be very, very polite. And I think he appears to me to be very perturbed by the kind of scrutiny that is rightly placed on him by the media now that he's taken on this role of prime minister. You can look at it, goes back a little bit further than this. If you look at his very, misleading would be a gentle way of putting it, answer around his role with Brookfield when they moved their headquarters from Canada to the USA, and how he was really unable to kind of come out of that with a clear answer. And in fact, he came out of it with an answer that was proven to be untrue. And then you see him here just viscerally almost reacting to sort of how dare you be asking me these kinds of questions, while avoiding answering the question that's being asked. I think it's revealing a side of him that's not the hypothetical Mark Carney, it's the real Mark Carney. And I suspect that Canadians in the scrutiny of the campaign are going to probably not react super well to that.
It's telling because I think the first time I saw that, and once I kind of recovered from the, oh my gosh, how condescending can you possibly be? I thought, well, of course, this is what he's used to. He's used to being the CEO. He's used to being the governor of a bank who doesn't get asked these questions. He's got probably a group of folks who hang around him and probably a lot of head nodders and pats on the shoulder, but he probably doesn't get a lot of this kind of questioning. And it strikes me that, we've heard that apparently he's been talking about being prime minister since the time that he was most recently in the UK, according to some things that I've read online. You would think he would be more prepared for stuff like this. When politicians come to this stage and they're on the big stage, this is the biggest stage in Canadian politics. You think they'd be prepared? You think that he would have had some time, and then we're not going into an election campaign soon, so he's not done any debate prep or anything like that, but still you would think that he would be prepared to say, okay, tone down the I'm better than you and I'm holier than thou, tone that down because it doesn't play well, and the media doesn't really let up. If you don't answer their questions, they kind of come at you harder. Do you think that it was a lack of prep, or do you think this is just who he is and we're going to learn that that's who he is more and more as we get closer to a campaign?
I think it's one of those things that's hard to practice yourself out of if it's if it's inherently who you are. We'll find out if he has that ability to kind of uh, alter, polish up, whatever you want to call it, his manner in those kinds of encounters. But those reporters' questions, they weren't unexpected and they weren't hard. And it really does raise the question that's at the center of it all is like, exactly what are those assets and why can't he, or why is he so resistant to answering the question? He knows the answer. He keeps obfuscating by saying that it's, he's done his whatever, he's put things into blind trust. Well, that's fine, but that's not, the question wasn't whether he put those things into blind trust. And so speaking of the word trust, it comes down to the question of trust. Like, can Canadians trust this guy who won't disclose the really basic information that he knows? And not only that, is getting angry when he's asked about it. Even look to his answer where he's talking about, he was basically bragging in that media scrum about meeting with world leaders. And that's another problem for him, I think, is he's meeting with world leaders before he meets with the elected representatives of Canadians, everyday Canadians in the House of Commons. He has not convened Parliament. He's not actually earned the democratic authority. Like, we elect parliaments, as the saying goes, we don't elect governments. Parliaments choose our government. He has not actually met Parliament to test that confidence either. So that's another issue where he's actually just going around the world on a bit of a junket, but not actually facing the sort of the test that gives him the democratic authority to actually be our prime minister in the first place.
All that being said, though, he has seemingly, and it may either be him or it may be the mere fact that Justin Trudeau is gone. But I'm just going to flip over to 338 here, and the popular vote projection has, and say what you will about polls, and it never ceases to amaze me, Caroline, how frequently we say don't trust the polls, and yet we always talk about polls. I think it now has become Canada's favorite pastime next to, I don't know what it is, complaining about the weather, or getting stuck in gridlock. Certainly if you're in Vancouver, no shade to people who drive around in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland. But this is really telling. You would not have seen this 20-point gap close so quickly, and now it's gone. And I was talking to my wife about it last night. We were going for a walk, and she said, and she's got her degree in poli-sci as well, and she said this is very clearly not something, in her opinion, and I would agree, that is a reflection of Pierre Poilievre. I think it is simply people wanted Trudeau gone. He's gone, and so now folks are running back to to the Liberals. And before I go to you on this, I just want to scroll down and take a look at this chart here, which shows 2022 to the most recent. And if you look at this trend, it's shocking to see how quickly the Conservatives have dropped and Liberals have taken over the position. So now they are a real contender for a minority, if not a majority government. So to all this, I asked, are we going into an election in the next 2 weeks, or do you think it will take into the fall? And what do you think about this whole shifting of public opinion and public perception?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I get scared around predicting anything. After 2013, I hung up my prediction hat and stopped. But that be in 2013 BC, I'm referring to, where everyone was sure that Adrian Dix would become BC's next premier.
This guy should pick a dog and he would win.
That's right, and that's me. You know, I thought the same thing. So that being said, do I think an election is around the corner? I think it's quite likely. I think Mark Carney's numbers, I don't know how much better they would get. He's new. He has that kind of honeymoon phase behind him. The other factor that he has, of course, is the Trump effect, which is probably not what Trump would wish for, but the sort of the impact it's having in terms of a rally around the flag effect with the Canadian public. I think that's a real thing. I think we actually saw it to some degree with COVID too. Any major national crises or threat, including threats to sovereignty, things like that, they do have that effect. And we saw a lot of incumbents reelected in the COVID pandemic, including the NDP right here in BC, as you'll recall. So I think that there's that as well. So Carney can say, look, I'm coming in, I'm new. I haven't really made people too mad yet. I have sort of the goodwill of being a new leader. And I have this Trump effect, which is, I think, boosting the Liberals' fortunes a lot more probably than Mark Carney himself is, although he probably has an impact as well. That said, how is it going to go? I mean, I think the increased scrutiny on him, as we talked about just right off the bat, I think that may not be as good as people think it's going to be on the Liberal side. I think he's not responded well in certain circumstances. So unless he kind of fixes that up and can adjust his manner, that'll be an issue. I also think there's the reality of, and I think this is true for every level of government. The Liberals aren't responsible for Trump's tariffs. Obviously, Trudeau's not responsible for that. Mark Carney's not responsible for that. But they certainly are responsible, Trudeau in particular, but the Liberal Party as a whole, for the position we're facing them from, right? $700 billion of new debt. The worst economic growth in the G7, actually the OECD, I believe, which is a bigger group of companies. Destroying our immigration system where we had a quite good consensus and then we no longer do. Pushing resource jobs out of Canada. Like the list goes on, increased food bag usage. You can go on and on. So those things, I mean, Canadians have to also look at that and say, like, has my life been better under these guys or worse? I would argue for a lot of people it's worse. It's just whether or not that kind of rally around the flag thing can offset that or not.
I noted in that little trajectory that I showed, the other thing that was really telling for me is how the NDP maintained some stability until just Trudeau resigns, and then suddenly the bottom falls out of the NDP to the point where they're almost in single digits, which is wild. I don't know the last time. I mean, maybe we're looking at pre-Jack Layton periods, to see the kind of floor fall out of the NDP. Do you think that they're going to be able to recapture some of that support? It's so clear that with this ascendancy of Carney, this kind of bump that he's had, has really shown that I think largely what you've had within the Jagmeet Singh Conservatives, at least since the last election, is people have just kind of parked a protest vote from the Liberals, probably with him for a bit, or they've maybe gone over legitimately to the Conservatives, but just kind of anticipating that something may change. And now they're fleeing as fast as they possibly can to go back to the Liberals. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think how the NDP is doing, that is to say very, very poorly, is bad news for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, obviously. The more vote that kind of pulls out at the Liberals, the better. It can be a really deciding factor in a number of seats, a number that I could name locally, that it'll have a major impact on. So I think you're right about the cause of that. I think the effect of it is not great for the Conservatives, but we'll see if they see some boost to their numbers. We'll start.
It went after Jagmeet Singh and his pension stuff too hard, that they should have maybe, because obviously they were trying to go for a little bit more of this blue collar kind of NDP voter in places like Timmins and places like Central Vancouver Island. But by taking down some of his credibility and kind of setting in place thoughts around, well, maybe he is just here for himself. Did they set a seed that maybe is now kind of blooming, for lack of a better word? Should they not have gone after him so hard and just kind of let him exist?
I think that they were absolutely right to pursue his voters. There's no question about that. I think that they've actually, carefully, even the Conservatives have done an excellent job, I think, of capturing in that kind of working class element, the kind of formerly or often NDP aligned Labour vote. I think that that's been great and a good strategy. It's just, yeah, does going after Jagmeet Singh himself and the NDP specifically have an impact whereby they reduce that vote enough that it's not enough to pull away Liberal vote in areas where it could help them? I mean, I would have to, I want to hesitate before I say definitively. I'm sure people who look far more into this kind of stuff than I do would have a better answer than me. But I think, yeah, it's hard to say, to be honest.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think I'll say just very personally, having been someone who was in the NDP for such a long time, having left during Jagmeet Singh's tenure, I, for one, am very hopeful for an NDP leader who can actually get back to what I would consider as doing the work of standing up for middle-class Canadians, because by and large, I think they've failed at that by having a leader who I think is very much all style and no substance, and who's proven time and time again to be very lacking in substance. And truly, I think, and this is just me, but I think it was a mistake to enter into a formal kind of coalition arrangement with the Liberals, because as we've shown many, many times in Canadian history, the signers on to those deals never tend to do very well in the next election. And I think that's certainly going to be the case here. Why don't we leave the federal scene and we'll go to Bill 7, because I have been talking to people about this since last Thursday or Friday, when it was Thursday, I think it was introduced, brought up. And so for folks who aren't aware, Bill 7 is called the Economic Stabilization Act, I believe, Tariff Act, or Fighting Tariffs Act, or something. I may have the actual name wrong. Was brought up by David Eby last week as a supposed plan to fight Donald Trump's tariffs. What it proposes to actually do, though, is really strip democratic accountability from the legislature, the 93 elected MLAs who sit in the Legislative Assembly and debate bills and bring amendments and do all of that stuff. This bill would allow them to essentially completely bypass the Legislative Assembly, where you have cabinet orders that cannot be signed and ministers can request authorities to do things and they have to do it within 60 days. It's just nuts. I mean, this is the kind of stuff to me that to fight Trump, you have to become Trump. And that's what I look at this as. And it's wild to me. What are your thoughts on it? Because as I'm sure as a political scientist, you must be thinking, like, this is bizarre.
It's totally shocking, to be honest with you. I say this not from a partisan perspective, but as somebody who's spent far too long in the depths of democratic theory. It's shocking. Effectively suspending the democratic process in British Columbia for over 2 years, more than half of his term. This is a guy, David Eby, who was elected with the slimmest of majorities. You have who now wants all of the power for himself and his cabinet, just bypassing the people that British Columbians have elected to represent that. I don't want to go into democratic theory, but there's a thing called responsible government, where the premier and cabinet are responsible to the elected legislature. That's the democratic link between decision makers and the people. And he is saying, I'm just going to not bother with that link because it's inconvenient. He does not have a mandate to do this, like not even close. No other jurisdiction in Canada is doing this. And they face the very same threat of tariff that we do. And it's completely unnecessary. He can convene the legislature at any time, including over the spring break period if he wanted to, but literally at any time, to bring matters forward to deal with the impact of these tariffs. Instead, he wants to basically completely bypass those processes, allow himself almost one-man rule effectively with the stroke of a pen, with far-reaching ability to do that on matters, anything related basically to economic development, which is almost anything. So it's really quite shocking. British Columbians should be very, very angry about it.
Well, and I think British Columbians and Canadians really should be really concerned about this, because the precedent is set here. There's no reason why it can't be set in other provinces. And that, too, in itself is kind of an odd thing, because if you need to do this to fight Trump, why hasn't any other province done this? We've had Doug Ford, lovingly called by Warren Kinsella Captain Canada. I don't know if he brought that up or made it up himself, but Doug Ford's been on the airwaves. Danielle Smith has been doing all the stuff that she can do. and had this whole Team Canada approach. But now this doesn't seem like a Team Canada approach. This seems like a Team David Eby approach, which is not dissimilar. I think back to an article that Von Palmer wrote just after the election last fall, where he said David Eby could learn a lot from John Horgan if he was more like John and less like, the kind of my way or the highway David Eby. He might not be seen as such an elitist, do what I say right now kind of politician, which I think is very much what this legislation is couched in. Is it's what I say and do it. And he's even said, we'll go to an election on this. And to me, like, that floored me as well. Does he really think if he goes to an election on this, that British Columbians are going to be like, oh, totally, take away our elected representative voices? Like, we'll totally vote for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to predict what British Columbians will do. I would hope that they would be really disturbed by this. It's unfortunately with David Eby, it is a bit of a pattern, right? He has frequently demonstrated an ends justify the means mentality to the democratic process. There's a whole bunch of examples. You look at his decision to, I forget, I have some notes here, but back in February 2023, so a couple of years ago, he was criticized for introducing the budget more than 3 weeks later than normal, delaying important matters of debate. Just recently this fall, delayed calling back the House, and usually calling back the House again actually is Mark Carney, just criticizing him for this. It's a really essential process, important part of the democratic process, because you get the authority of the legislature to govern. He just didn't do that for 4 months and ruled essentially, like, as far as the legislature is concerned, unopposed. He's done a Bill 44 with the housing bill, right, where he has completely overrided locally elected councils and actually literally eliminated public hearings on certain developments that he wants to see done across the province. So there's a whole bunch of things. Don't forget, he came to power as premier, having his own campaign team actively work to disqualify his only rival in the race. So he was just declared with no vote as premier of British Columbia, not even amongst party members. So this is like a long-standing pattern, but I would say it is a marked progression in that sort of habit that he's shown, where this goes way, way, way too far. I would hope that British Columbians would look at this if we did end up in an election over it as just something that they untenable to them. But anyway, I'll let you ask your next question, because I'm going to ramble if I'm not careful.
No, I love a ramble. I mean, the only thing I can think of on top of that is that, unfortunately, I think Canadians and British Columbians tend to be a little passive when it comes to what our politicians do or don't do, or what they promise and don't promise. And sometimes, I mean, it's democracy. People are going to respond the way they're going to respond. But I've always been surprised at the things that people react to and don't react to sometimes. I mean, I'm with you. It's my hope that if you ran an election on give me ultimate power, that people would say no. I mean, at the end of Von Palmer's most recent article, he said, British Columbians didn't elect a king. They elected a parliament to have a premier, right? And I don't know. I mean, it feels a little weird, but I also feel a little bit hopeless about the scenario, which I'm now just discovering, and doesn't feel all that great.
Well, the interesting thing, though, is I think there's a real opportunity to stop this, right? And it would be very embarrassing to David Eby, but I think it's the right thing to do. And I think that it comes to I think we can just assume Conservatives and the 3 independent MLAs are they're gonna vote against it, right? They're gonna say this is undemocratic and we'll never allow this to happen. So it comes down to NDP MLAs and Green MLAs. NDP MLAs are going to have to turn around and tell their communities why, in very concerning times, even as we have a president to the south stomping all over constitutional conventions and the democratic process. We have a premier here where they're, are they going to tell their constituents, yeah, we've agreed to just abdicate our responsibility to you and let the premier bypass whatever input we might have on behalf of you, our citizens. I suspect they'll succumb to pressure from the premier's office and just vote for the bill. And then it comes down to the Greens. And the Greens have the same question to ask. They need to say, we've been given the trust by the people who voted for us to represent our communities. Are we going to turn around and tell them that we voted to completely abdicate our ability to advocate for them in the legislature? And those Green MLAs, as we know, if you add up the Conservatives, the Independents, and the Greens, you'd have a 46 tie in the legislature. And there's the Speaker. The Speaker, by parliamentary convention, only votes in the case of a tie. And if there's a tie, their job is, typically, according to parliamentary convention, to vote in favor of either keeping debate going or in favor of the status quo, but not in favor of drastic changes in legislation. So the Speaker could violate convention. That can happen. But that's a very awkward position to find yourself in if you're day. Hopefully the speaker would do the right thing as well. So there is an opportunity that this actually could be stopped. I think over the next 2 weeks or just under 2 weeks between now and when the legislature opens back up, every single British Columbian should reach out to their MLA and demand that they not give up their voice in our legislature.
I think that is absolutely vital that British Columbians do that. And you alluded to it. So for the last few minutes here of our chat, time goes by so fast. I just want to talk about what's happening with the right in British Columbia, because we saw last week the removal of Dallas Brody from the Conservative caucus, and then the two other MLAs joined her. They're now independents. It is assumed that they're going to form some kind of caucus over on their side, and now there's 41 Conservative MLAs. You wrote in the Western Standard about kind of the truth and reconciliation. Is it truth or reconciliation? And I don't want to dive too much into that specific issue. It was a very good article, and I'm going to link to it in the show notes because I do think people should look at it. But generally, some of the commentary I've seen around this is, oh, you know what? It didn't take very long for the right to fracture in BC. It is now broken. And, David Eves must be laughing all the way to the bank on this kind of thing. I'm interested in your perspective because mine is not so grave as this. I think, the Conservative Party in what it managed to do in 18 months, go from 1 seat to 44, and then move itself into a legislature is very much kind of a brand new creation that found itself in a place that I don't think many political parties have ever found themselves before, perhaps save the Ontario NDP in 1990 when they suddenly formed government out of thin air. And I think maybe what this has done is kind of consolidate that Conservative Party MLA base into a focused opposition now, because it did feel like for a bit that things were kind of shooting off into all directions. What do you think about that? And do you think that this kind of shows more internal divides, or do you think that they're moving to a place where they can be a more focused opposition?
Yeah, I don't think that this is the end of the right in British Columbia, or even necessarily that it represents a huge opportunity for the NDP. I suspect that on most issues, those independent MLAs are going to be voting along with the Conservatives, and sort of the numbers in terms of the votes won't be significantly impacted. And I also don't think that there's super fertile electoral ground to the right of the Conservatives going into the next election, right? So I don't think that those MLAs will be a significant threat, frankly. I think that they've got more concern probably towards the center of something popping up there, and that's a whole other story that we can get into. But yeah, I think like you said it yourself, the Conservative Party is new. It accomplished a lot. It ran a really widely ranged party in terms of ideological views. And I think they have been struggling to kind of manage those. I think John Rustad has opted for the option of kind of a freer hand, free votes, things like that, where people don't feel, and free expression amongst its caucus. That's one way of dealing with it. Another way would be to have a much heavier hand, whip all the votes, and probably would have faced this kind of dissent a lot sooner. They'll say people would probably have left caucus by now, one way or the other. So, but wasn't this issue, it would have been something else, is kind of, I guess, what I'm getting at. I do think you're right in terms of there being some benefit, I think, practically speaking, for the Conservatives to have a little bit more breathing room inside their caucus without some of those more active dissenting voices, where they can maybe try to focus their message a little bit more. So not to get into the rights and wrongs of where everything landed, but certainly I do think this is not the end of the right in British Columbia. And I think, or of this party, I think that they'll go on and be a very competitive force in the next election.
Capturing the center is important. What do the Conservatives need to do to ensure that they're capturing the center while maintaining their base? Because that is going to be a challenge for them.
It's always a challenge. Look, the Conservatives do not need to stop being conservatives. I think they can be conservatives and still capture a wide range of British Columbians who are interested in things like, all the things that John Rustad put forward in his last platform with the Conservatives, but showing that there is room in that tent for more conservatively minded people from what used to be BC United, for example. Like sending that message that we do want to grow this tent. It does not mean giving up on your principles. It means focusing your message on the things that can appeal to all of those factions. And so I think it's a hard line to walk. Like, it's not easy. I don't envy him with this job, but I think it's an important part of making sure, like I've said frequently, that the party that has the most power over how well a future potential centrist party has is actually the Conservatives. If they make a home for more moderately minded conservatives within their party, then those folks will make their home there and they'll stay there. But if they leave it, they leave it in such a way that people don't feel like they can find that home there, then they'll be looking for a home elsewhere. And so I think that's the challenge that he has. It's not an easy one.
Caroline Elliott, Political commentator, thank you so much. Did you have any final thoughts before I let you go back to your day?
I don't think so. I just appreciate you having me on. I think you do a great job, and I'm excited to see how this and your next interviews turn out.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I really appreciate your time with me here today, and we will definitely get you back because I think there's never there's never a small amount of things to talk about. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you.